She's like a sickness in my brain, a vision standing by the window pane. She ripples through the blinds and leaves me in a daze. It's in the way her body moves me, the way she grabs me and intoxicates, until the signals in my mind forget to operate. Fragile skull. I take my pleasure from my alcohol.
Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another Coffee and Crime Time. After this video, we will resume with the Bonnie and Clyde series, which should only have 2 videos left. After I'm finished recording this and editing it, I'm actually going to go ahead and prepare the notes and the script for the video that I'm going to record tomorrow. So that'll be part 4 of the Bonnie and Clyde series. And then after that, I have another deep dive that I'm working on that is more of the true crime variety, as well as a couple other Coffee and Crime Times. So I think there will be plenty this month to keep everyone happy, because that's what I'm about. Life sucks right now and has for the past year. So whatever I can do to make everybody a little happier, I am happy to do it. Today we're covering a Jane Doe case, one of the oldest unsolved Jane Doe cases in Arizona history. And just at the end of last month, there were some recent developments. We're going to discuss the case. We're also going to discuss how this specific Jane Doe, who's been called Valentine Sally due to the day she was discovered on, how she was able to get her name back due to DNA technology and a police force that never forgot about her, even after 4 decades. But before we dive in, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark VPN. Surfshark is a modern VPN designed with the user in mind. And in my case, the user in mind is technologically challenged. Anything I use, whether it be software or an app or even a video game, it needs to be streamlined and intuitive. It needs to be easy to use. If there's too many steps or any kind of learning curve, I'm out, because I just don't have the time or patience to learn something new at this point when it comes to technology, and that's why I really love Surfshark. It's almost as if they actually want to make your life easier, not harder. And how many people or companies can we say that about, truly? When turned on, Surfshark encrypts all data sent via the internet, protecting your passwords, your private messages and photos, and other sensitive data from prying eyes.
Private eyes, they're watching you.
Why would you want to be using Surfshark VPN? Well, I can give you a couple of reasons. Your internet service provider can see your internet traffic and logs your browsing history. When you're using Surfshark VPN, they can't do that anymore. And Surfshark has a strict no-logs policy that means they do not monitor, track, or store what you do online. Another reason is if you're not a fan of censorship and it bothers you when websites aren't available in your area, Surfshark has a solution for that too. With their no borders mode, the internet is open to everyone. So if there's something on Netflix in another country that you've been wanting to watch and it's not available where you live, you now can watch it with Surfshark. I was just talking to someone on Twitter the other day who said that the Netflix docuseries that I was featured in, the crime scene one with Elisa Lam, they said they couldn't watch it in their country. So I suggested that they try out Surfshark, and then they did, and they were able to watch it. No problem. Another reason why you might want to use Surfshark is because free public Wi-Fi is very dangerous. And it's unbelievably easy for someone who knows what they're doing to access your personal data while they're on the same public network as you. Where I live in Rochester, New York, there's a technology college. It's called RIT, and any first-year RIT student will be able to do this. So it's really not hard or complicated unless you're me and you're technologically challenged, and anything with technology is hard and complicated. Surfshark uses industry-leading encryption to guard your data. Best of all, Surfshark offers their services to you on unlimited devices. You can connect and use all your family's devices at the same time with no additional cost. And I think that's probably one of their best and most unique features. So I can make sure that on my kids' tablets, Surfshark's on there so that they're not getting any weird targeted ads. I can make sure that on my husband's phone or his work computer, Surfshark's on there. On my phone, my work computer, my tablets, everything can be covered unlimited. Surfshark VPN is something I use every single day. It's easy, I don't have to think about it, and I can surf easy knowing that I have freedom, privacy, and safety in this crazy place we call the Wild Wild Web. For a limited time, Surfshark VPN is offering viewers of this channel 83% off a 2-year plan and 3 extra months for free at surfshark.deals/stephanieharlowe. This special offer makes your subscription just $2.21 a month, which I think is a small price to pay to browse securely on all your devices and not get these stupid targeted ads and to know really who's viewing what you're viewing. Once again, that's surfshark.deals/stephanieharlowe, and there's an E on the end of Stephanie and Harlowe. Thank you so much to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of you out there who understand that sponsors are essential to this channel, and I'm never going to suggest that you try something or spend your hard-earned money on something that I don't 100% believe in and use myself. Let's dive into the video. It was February 14th, 1982. An Arizona Department of Public Safety officer was searching for a tire that had come off a passing truck near the I-40 freeway exit between Ash Fork, Arizona and Williams, Arizona. It was early in the morning, this was routine work, and the DPS officer was expecting nothing unusual. But on this February morning, something unusual was found. Instead of coming upon a discarded tire, the officer found the discarded body of a young woman off to the side of the road, lying face down underneath a cedar tree about 20 feet from the interstate. She was naked from the waist up, wearing only size 9 Seasons brand designer jeans. Not far from her body, a maroon and white striped sweater was found, as well as a size 36C bra. This young woman had no identification on her. Law enforcement could not figure out who she was. There was no missing persons reports in the area that matched her description, and an autopsy was done, and it was determined that she died roughly 2 weeks before her body was discovered. Her body was in an advanced state of decomposition, and animals had eaten off most of her face as well as her right ear. Because of the state of her body, investigators were unable to get her fingerprints, but they were hoping to identify Valentine Sally through either DNA or dental records, both of which were collected and cataloged. Valentine Sally was thought to have been between the ages of 15 and 20. She had strawberry blonde hair, blue eyes, and scars on her left foot and one of her thighs, and these were healed scars, so they were from older injuries. Her left ear was pierced, and it is assumed that her right ear would have been pierced as well, but it was never recovered. She had been approximately 5'4" and between 120 and 125 pounds. The medical examiner did not find signs or evidence of a sexual assault, and Valentine Sally's cause of death was never determined, even though it is believed she was suffocated due to the lack of any physical marks and the absence of a broken hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is a horseshoe-shaped bone situated in the anterior midline of the neck between the chin and the thyroid cartilage. So, the reason the police believe she was suffocated instead of strangled is because this bone was not broken or fractured on Valentine Sally. And according to Stan Kephart, a retired police chief from Arizona, he claimed that in 9 out of 10 cases of strangulation, this bone will be found fractured. I did find other sources that put that number a bit lower, saying that the bone will be found fractured in only 1/3 of all homicides by strangulation, but I'm sure there were other factors, such as the absence of bruising on her neck, which led investigators to believe she'd been suffocated instead of strangled. But I do find it odd that Valentine Sally was found in this state of undress, but yet there were no signs of a sexual assault.
Are you surprised that there was no evidence of sexual assault?
That is, again, very surprising. What would be the purpose of your anger or a vendetta of some type? I'm speculating now, would be maybe a cause of doing this. That and the way that she died are two of the most curious things in this case.
One more thing that was discovered during the autopsy was that one of Sally's teeth had been drilled in preparation for a root canal a week before her death. During the following investigation, a few sightings of Valentine Sally surfaced. A student at Northern Arizona University claimed he'd picked up a hitchhiker fitting Sally's description while traveling north near Cords Junction on February 2nd, 1982. He claimed that the girl had told him she was coming from Phoenix, where she'd been living with some friends, and she was working as a dishwasher. This hitchhiker told the student that she was heading for the Little America truck stop in Flagstaff, Arizona, where she was hoping to find a trucker that would give her a ride to New Jersey, where she needed to end up due to some family problems. So from Cords Junction to the area that Valentine Sally would later be found, it's about 110 miles and only about an hour and a half drive, depending, I guess, on how fast or slow you drive. Police, with a picture of Valentine Sally in hand, traveled around the area her body had been discovered in, and they asked anyone if they'd seen her around during the month of February. And at the Monte Carlo rest stop in Ash Fork, just a mile away from where Sally had been discovered, someone believed that they had seen her. Patty Wilkins was a young woman who had moved from California to Arizona with her family. In Arizona, they opened the Monte Carlo truck stop, and truck stops are mainly meant for truckers to fuel up or to even just park and sleep overnight. So there's usually bathrooms where you can wash up, there's stores, little convenience stores, and there's usually a diner attached to the rest stop, and Patty worked in the diner. She couldn't remember exactly the date, but she believed it was February 2nd or February 3rd, 1982, when she was working the graveyard shift at the diner, and she saw a young woman matching Valentine Sally's description walk into the diner accompanied by an older man who looked to be in his 50s. Patty claimed it was between 2 and 3 in the morning, and it wasn't typical for young girls to be in the truck stop that late. So Patty paid special attention to her 2 new customers and made it a point to check in with the girl to make sure that she was okay, which seemed to be a habit at the Monte Carlo rest stop. I went through newspapers.com and found some older articles on this case, and in 1986, Patty Wilkins told the Tampa Tribune, quote, "We've been in this little truck stop for 17 years, and as a rule, when a girl comes in off a truck and looks too young, we pull her off, and the sheriff's office comes along and sends her home," end quote. But that didn't happen in this specific situation, and there's a couple reasons for that. Patty had felt that this specific scenario was a bit different. Typically, if she saw young girls in the truck stop, at a very late time, she would ask the young girl, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Things like that. But when Patty asked this young girl, who we assume is Valentine Sally, if she was okay and if she wanted to stay at the rest stop with Patty or continue on with the man, the girl responded that she would stay with the man. And Patty felt that the girl and this man were very comfortable with each other. I believe she used the word camaraderie, like they had this level of closeness that made her feel the man was probably an uncle or the girl's father. The man ordered coffee, but the girl only ordered water. And when Patty asked her if she was okay, the girl responded that she wasn't really doing okay because she had this terrible toothache. When police interviewed Patty and she told them about the girl's toothache, they asked her which side the toothache had been on, and Patty responded that the toothache had been on the left side, and she remembered this because she had crushed up some baby aspirin, and she gave it to the girl to place on her tooth. Now, I believe that this whole placing the aspirin directly on the tooth that has the toothache was kind of an old school belief, I guess, because I don't believe that it's effective that way. So I found this article on drjrob.com, and it looks like this is a dentist, and it says, "True or false, you should put an aspirin on a toothache," and it says false, aspirin is salicylic acid, with acid being the key word. As the aspirin dissolves, the acid ends up on your cheek, gums, tongue, and other soft tissues and creates a burn. Sometimes the burn is a white area, and sometimes it's an ulcer. In short, putting an aspirin on your tooth for a toothache is about as effective as taping one to your forehead when you have a headache, and it could lead to additional damage to your mouth. That being said, crushing up aspirin and putting it on a bad pimple, I've heard, is very effective. So I guess it's one of those old wives' tales. So if you hear it and you think it's a good idea, I probably wouldn't do it. But you can take some water and swallow the aspirin, and that would be probably pretty helpful for a toothache. Sorry for the little interruption in the story, but I'm always curious as to why people do these kinds of things or like where it came from. So I wanted to see if I could find out. And if there was actually any truth to the fact that if you crush up aspirin and put it on a toothache, it'll work. So when Patty told the police that the toothache was on the left side of the girl's mouth, they confirmed that the girl they'd found dead on the side of the road and the girl that Patty had cared for that early February night were one and the same because Valentine Sally still had the aspirin on her tooth. That obviously wasn't the only way they made the identification, though. Patty also traveled to Flagstaff to view more pictures of Sally's body, and while there, she also identified the clothes that Sally was wearing as the same clothes the girl in the truck stop had been wearing the night she'd seen her, jeans and a white and maroon striped sweater. So due to the short distance between the Monte Carlo and the place Sally had been found, remember it was just about a mile, as well as the fact that Sally was wearing the same clothes and still had the baby aspirin on her tooth, police believed that Valentine Sally had been killed shortly after leaving the diner, most likely within hours. The belt loops on her jeans had been ripped, and it appeared as if she'd been dragged to the place where she was eventually found. Now, this specific area on the interstate where Sally was found, it's a long incline, and it was common for trucks to pull over and cool their brakes or just rest their eyes in this specific area. So it wouldn't be strange to see one or several trucks parked on the side of the road in this area, and it would have raised no alarms. Stan Kephart, remember he was a retired sheriff from Arizona, he believes that her belt loops could have been ripped during her actual attack, during like a struggle, but he thinks it's much more likely she was killed inside of a vehicle and then dragged by her belt loops to where she was later found. There's also been some speculation that the belt loops were ripped when she was yanked out of the vehicle. Maybe she was half carried, half dragged to the place that she was found because it was about 25 feet away from the road. But there was speculation that her belt loops may have been ripped and torn when she was yanked out of the vehicle. And this obviously raises the question of who the man was that was last seen with her. All Patty could remember about him was that he seemed to be older, in his 50s, and he was wearing a cowboy hat with a peacock feather in it. Patty Wilkins didn't see the truck that he came or left in, but she also doesn't necessarily believe that he was responsible for what happened to Valentine Sally. She said the man didn't seem like the type. He was very nice to Sally, and he seemed genuinely concerned about the pain she was experiencing with her toothache. He seemed like a family member who was worried about her. However, Stan Kephart and the rest of the investigators on this case feel it's highly likely that the man Patty saw was directly involved in the murder, but they have no idea who he is. And there's something a little contradictory in the statements that the police make. So Stan Kephart, in an interview, said, usually people are killed by somebody that they know, especially young people, so a family member or somebody that they trust.
What's the likelihood that the man she was seen with is involved in this?
It is highly likely. The victims of homicides, more often than not, are victims from known persons.
But I think there's also been speculation in the Cocomino Sheriff's Office, who was the main law enforcement agency who's handling this case, that she was with somebody she'd hitched a ride with. So I'm not sure exactly how they can say, oh, it's most common for something to happen to a young girl by somebody she knows, but also say that this was somebody she'd hitched a ride with. Once they had more information, once they'd gotten the report from Patty, the work started to identify Valentine Sally and give her her name back. There was no missing persons reported in the area that matched her description. And even though they had her dental scans and her DNA, this was 1982, right? There weren't DNA databases to compare to. So they would have first needed to have a theory of who Sally might have been and then track down a family member and then compare Sally's DNA to the potential family member. And the same goes for her teeth. They had them and that was helpful, but without something to compare them to, there wasn't much that they could do with them. And that's really the big difference between what law enforcement and investigatory work was like in the 80s and even, the early 90s and what it's like now, because we have these DNA databases to reference. We have these databases to put in a victim's DNA or to put in an unknown DNA sample found at the scene and hopefully find out either who the victim is or who their attacker was. And although I've been outspoken in the past about how uncomfortable I am with these DNA companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com and how it just makes me feel really weird that these companies basically have everybody's DNA just stored there and who knows what they're doing with it, I am starting to change my stance a little bit when it comes to law enforcement and cases and hopefully finding justice for somebody. I'm probably still not going to give my DNA to these companies, but I can say that if I had a relative, somebody close to me who was missing, who I shared the same DNA with, I probably would. So the sheriff in 1982, his name was Jack Judd, and he was highly disturbed by the case. It bothered him that this young girl had been murdered, but she didn't have a name, and there didn't seem to be people out there who were looking for her or wanting answers or wanting to find her. Over the next 2 years, he devoted every spare minute, and a lot of these spare minutes were his own personal time, off the clock. And he looked at almost 2,000 FBI printouts of missing girls, and he communicated with different police agencies all over the United States trying to give Valentine Sally her name back. And in July of 1984, Sheriff Judd felt he might have found the answer. 14-year-old Melody Cutlip had run away from her Florida home in 1980. She was about the right age, she was blonde, the height and the weight were spot on, and they thought they might have put the pieces together. Using Valentine Sally's teeth and pictures of Melody Cutlip, that's right, I said pictures, not dental records, an orthodontist from Albuquerque named Dr. Homer Campbell positively ID'd Valentine Sally as Melody Cutlip. Dr. Homer claimed to be an expert on identifying people using their teeth, and since he didn't have access to Melody's dental records, he just compared her teeth in pictures to Sally's teeth, and he said, "Great Scott, I've done it. These two girls are one and the same." Melody's mother was contacted, and to her credit, she never believed that the body found in Arizona was her daughter. She said that Melody had never had dental work done, and she really had no idea how her daughter would have even gotten to Arizona from Florida. So when Valentine Sally had been found and no one claimed her, Patty at the Monte Carlo, she set up a donation jar in the diner, and she was able to raise $300 for a headstone. Most of the people who donated were truckers going in and out, and I know in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about how some of these truckers, not the ones who donated, but some of them in general in the world and history, have used their job as truckers to prey on innocent people. But broad generalizations of any kind make me very uncomfortable. I don't like them. I think they're damaging. So it's not to say all truckers are bad, right? We can clearly see that some truckers are really good people. They donated to help this young girl who didn't have a family and didn't have someone to give her a proper burial. They helped give her that. And for every trucker out there in history who's used his job and his anonymity and his location to victimize somebody, there's 100 more that haven't done that. There's 100 more that have given hitchhikers and people down on their luck rides and expected nothing in return from them. So I just want to be clear about that. Once the headstone was paid for, they had it engraved with the words Valentine Sally, and Sally was laid to rest in the Williams Cemetery. Now, when the identification was made by Dr. Homer saying Melody Cutlip was Valentine Sally, Melody's name was actually engraved and added to that stone, even though her own mother had refused to buy into it. And they had even asked her mother, like, should we ship the body to you so you can bury it, in your hometown? And Melody's mother was like, no, dude, what don't you get about this? I don't think this is my daughter, so I don't want you to send the body of somebody who's not my daughter to me to bury. But that's how sure everyone was based on Dr. Homer's statements, sure enough to add Melody's name to this gravestone. But then in 1986, Melody Cutlip, alive and well, returned home. She was now 18, engaged to be married, and she told her family she'd been traveling around the country, like working at craft fairs. The following year, 1987, Valentine Sally's body was exhumed so that her skull could be x-rayed, and although Melody's family had requested that Melody's name be taken off the headstone, the last time I checked, it wasn't the case. It was still there, which is so awkward. Can you imagine being a young girl, you run away from home, a couple years later you come back, and your name's on a headstone? There is a sad side story about Melody Cutlip, though. Even though she was alive and well in 1986, she would die young. When she was 32, she was driving home from work in bad weather and her car hit some water and it sent her crashing into an oncoming truck, killing her instantly. So retired Sheriff Stan Kephart actually called the misidentification a huge case misstep, saying, quote, "It is the fault of the expert presenting something that was flawed and the agency not vetting that person to conclude that it should be followed up on," end quote. So there's this website, I think, called True Crime Arizona, and they have covered this case pretty thoroughly. And there was some question onto whether or not this case was a cold case. Once the whole Melody Cutlip thing fell through, they didn't really have anything else to go on, so it really did go cold for several years. Remember, this happened in 1982, the whole Melody Cutlip thing, 1984. By 1986, they'd figured out that wasn't the case, and they had nothing else to go on. So at the end of last year, True Crime Arizona attempted to sit down with the Coconino Sheriff's Office to discuss this case that should be considered cold. It's been 40 years. Apparently, the Coconino County Sheriff's Office declined to sit down for an interview about Valentine Sally, and the reporter who asked them for an interview claimed that they told her the case was still open. It wasn't considered a cold case, and she even put in, a Freedom of Information Act request and did all this stuff trying to get the information. So the journalist asked retired Sheriff Kephart, do you think that they're actually having people actively investigating this right now? And Kephart said no. He said, quote, "This one is too cold for them to devote the resources that could be better devoted to successful prosecution of somebody they can take off the street by arresting them," end quote. But it turns out the reason law enforcement may not have wanted to speak to this journalist about Valentine Sally's case at the end of 2020 was because they did have new information, new evidence about the case, especially concerning Sally's real identity. As soon as the CODIS database became available, Valentine Sally's DNA was put into CODIS, but there was never any hits. But in 2013, the Coconino Sheriff's Office actually received some grant money from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and this helped law enforcement pay money to place Sally's DNA, amongst others, into a system that holds familial DNA. And on Monday, February 22nd, 2021, it was announced that Valentine Sally had been identified, for real this time. Her name was Carolyn Eaton. She was 17 when she ran away from her St. Louis home around Christmas Day in 1981. Apparently at that time, there was never an official missing persons report filed, and she'd been a troubled teenager who was having issues at home. Other than that, we don't know anything about Carolyn. What troubles she was going through with her family, what her family life was like, what she was like, who she was, or why she was never reported missing. Because according to a woman who lived across the street from the Eatons in the 80s and who'd been good friends with Carolyn's sister, everyone was terribly worried when Carolyn ran away. And although having her real name helps to put some more of the puzzle together, it doesn't answer the most important question: who killed her and why? Was the man with the cowboy hat someone she knew, or just someone who'd picked her up at some point between St. Louis and Arizona? Was Carolyn the girl the college student had picked up, the girl who said she needed to get to New Jersey, so she was heading to a truck stop hoping to find a ride east with a trucker? The statement of this college student is very vague, and something important's missing from it, right? Like, where did he drop her off? Patty felt the man with Carolyn wasn't the type to hurt her, and he seemed genuinely concerned for her well-being. So did Carolyn run into someone else who was less well-intentioned? Or was the man with the peacock feather in his cowboy hat just trying to earn her trust? And why did this happen to her? There was no sign of a sexual assault, which seems to be, in general, right, the main motive for taking and killing a young girl. So what was the motive here if there was no sexual assault? It does seem to be more personal at that point. It does seem like maybe this man who was with her knew her. On the other hand, it feels like a lot of these Jane Doe cases have this in common. These young girls are found on the side of some highway, freeway, interstate, and they're thrown away like garbage. Some of the most notorious serial killers of our time operated in this exact way simply because they knew there would be people hitchhiking. There'd be vulnerable people hitchhiking, people who maybe don't have homes, people who don't have families who are worried about them, or if they do have families that are worried about them, they're not anywhere close. Runaways, orphans, sex workers, people that these violent offenders don't think will be missed. This is an abuse of power. It's an inequality thing, because if somebody's hitchhiking, they don't have money, they don't have a car, they don't have anyone to help them get where they need to go. They need you, the person who's picking them up. So you're in an unequal position here. You have something that they want, so they're going to be a little bit more trusting and a little less cautious. So these violent predators stalk their prey on these highways. They pick them up, they do whatever they want to them, they kill them, and then they dispose of them, right? And when they're done doing that, they just hop back on the road and drive. By the time anyone finds the body, the killer would be 3 states over. And if they worked as a truck driver, they'd most likely have no actual connection to the area where the murder was committed. And they would also have a viable reason of why they'd been there if they were ever questioned. It was just part of their route. Look at William Bonin, for instance. He was a former truck driver who earned himself the nickname the Freeway Killer because he targeted victims between the ages of 12 and 19. He strangled them and then disposed of their bodies on the side of the highway. He was arrested on June 11, 1980 in Hollywood, California, the state he primarily worked out of, and he was later found guilty of 10 murders in LA County and an additional 4 murders in Orange County. We also have the New Bedford Highway Killer. And this killer doesn't have an actual name because even though he operated in the late 80s and is thought to be responsible for the murders of at least 9 women and the disappearance of 2 more women, he's never been identified. His victims were all taken from New Bedford. They were found in different surrounding towns along Route 140. Another unidentified killer who stalked his victims using the roadways is called the I-70 Killer, and he left a series of victims behind him throughout 3 different states. Then we have the I-45 Killer. Since the 1970s, more than 40 young women have mysteriously disappeared or turned up dead along Texas Interstate 45. A mile from Highway 45 is a 25-acre patch of land bordering an oil field that is now called the Killing Fields, and that's where many of these bodies were disposed of and discovered. Outside of the ones who have been found, there's several more young women in the area that simply disappeared and were never found. The fields have been described as the perfect place to kill, and the director of the film Texas Killing Fields said, quote, "You could see the I-45, but if you yelled, no one would necessarily hear you, and if you ran, there wouldn't necessarily be anywhere to go." End quote. According to an article written by The Independent, the true golden age of highway killers was the 70s and 80s. Author Ginger Strand talks about this in her book, Killer on the Road, and she says, quote, "Starting in the 1950s, Americans eagerly built the planet's largest public work, the 42,795-mile national system of interstate and defense highways. Before the concrete was dry on the new roads, however, a specter began haunting them, the highway killer. He went by many names: the Hitcher, the Freeway Killer, the Killer on the Road, the I-5 Strangler, and the Beltway Sniper. Some of these criminals were imagined, but many were real. The nation's murder rate shot up as its expressways were built. America became more violent and more mobile at the same time." End quote. In 2009, it was posted on the FBI's website that they were addressing an emerging pattern of serial killings on highways. The post says, quote, "In 2004, an analyst from the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation detected a crime pattern. The bodies of murdered women were being dumped along the Interstate 40 corridor in Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Mississippi. The analyst and a police colleague from the Grapevine, Texas Police Department, referred these cases to our Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, or VICAP, where our analysts looked at other records in our databases to see if there were similar patterns of highway killings elsewhere. Turns out there were, so we launched an extensive effort to support our state and local partners with open investigations into highway murders. Today, we're publicly announcing our Highway Serial Killings Initiative to raise awareness among law enforcement agencies and the general public about this issue and our unique assistance on these cases." End quote. The post on the FBI website goes on to say, quote, "The suspects are predominantly long-haul truck drivers, but the mobile nature of the offenders, the unsafe lifestyles of the victims, the significant distances and multiple jurisdictions involved, and the scarcity of witnesses or forensic evidence can make these cases tough to solve." End quote. And what does that sound like? It sounds like Valentine Sally's case. It sounds like Walker County Jane Doe's case. It sounds like Newcastle County Jane Doe. It sounds like Odessa Jane Doe. It sounds like dozens and dozens of cases where these young girls and men have been taken and then thrown on the side of the highway after they were murdered and usually sexually assaulted. And of course, we're all familiar with the stories of Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. They traveled across the country, sometimes together, sometimes separately, raping, murdering, and bringing violence and death wherever they went. They've claimed that together, the number of their victims is over 600. Now, there's a lot of doubt cast on this, right? We're not sure what the accurate number is, but this is what they've claimed. Lucas and Toole met in 1976, and they instantly became lovers and partners in crime. Both the men had already done time in prison before, specifically for murder. Henry Lee Lucas served 10 years for the murder of his own mother. Otis Toole had only been 14 years old when he lured a traveling salesman into the woods and then ran the man over with his own car. For both men, killing would become something that wasn't done out of necessity, but because it brought them pleasure. They enjoyed killing, and it became an addiction of sorts for them. Together, Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole traveled around 26 states in the 70s, killing as many people as they could, but they mostly sought out victims whose lifestyles made them more vulnerable, such as runaways, sex workers, migrant workers. After law enforcement put them both behind bars again, putting an end to their murder spree, Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas confessed to a plethora of crimes, even though they had nothing to do with some of them. Otis Toole insisted he'd murdered 6-year-old Adam Walsh, leading police to a bench outside of a Sears store where he claimed to have kidnapped Adam from. He also brought authorities to a turnpike where Toole said that he remembered Adam crying for his mother. After this, he brought them to a bridge in Jacksonville and explained how he had cut Adam's head off. Toole was technically never charged with Adam's murder, and his story changed many times over the years. But Adam's father, John Walsh, believes that Otis Toole was the person who took his son and murdered him. And in 2008, the Hollywood police agreed and closed the case. It doesn't help give Toole credibility, though, when his buddy Henry Lee Lucas has openly admitted to falsely confessing to dozens, if not hundreds, of murders that he had nothing to do with. And he's become infamous for this. Henry Lee Lucas admitted that confessing to these crimes gained him extra privileges in prison, and every time he did it, he got to leave his cell. He got to leave the prison and go to different places with the police so he could bring them to the scene and tell them what happened. And he really liked this because sometimes the police would stop and get him fast food on the way. So he basically just did it to take a break from jail. But before he died, Henry Lee Lucas bragged that he made fools out of the police and that he was out to wreck Texas law enforcement. So let's look at Carolyn's case. She runs away in December of 1981 and somehow manages to make it almost 1,400 miles from St. Louis to Arizona, most likely by hitchhiking. By February of 1982, almost a year after she'd left her home, Carolyn was still alive and doing okay, aside from the toothache, right? But we have no idea who she was with or what she'd been doing up until that point. She must have gotten dental work done at some point since her teeth had been prepared for a root canal. According to the American Association of Endodontists, most root canals can be done in 1 or 2 appointments. The first appointment is the procedure itself, where the infected pulp is removed. The second appointment is when the root canal gets cleaned and filled with a crown or some other filling agent to preserve it from infection. So it looks like what happened here is Carolyn went to her first appointment, but didn't make it back for her second. And as a result, her tooth probably got infected, and it was very painful for her. Healthline.com says that after a root canal, you can wait 1 or 2 weeks before getting the crown. But anything after that, you're pushing it and you're running the risk of infection. How Carolyn was able to pay to have the dental work done is confusing to me, especially because I would assume she didn't have health insurance. Maybe she didn't have the money to go back for the crown. Maybe the person who did the dental work was a friend of hers or a dentist who felt bad for her and did it pro bono. I have no idea. But I would be curious to know where she was staying and who she was staying with and why these people have never come forward. Because I can't imagine she was just hitchhiking around the country for a year. She must have found herself someplace at some point for an extended period of time. So Carolyn is alive and well on February 2nd when she got a ride from the college student. She's fine when Patty sees her in the diner, like I said, except for that toothache, and then she leaves the diner and ends up dead, only a mile away. It does make sense that the man she was with would have been the one who did this to her since she seemed comfortable with him. She told Patty that she was going to stay with him, so why would she break away from this man so soon after telling Patty that she was good to stay with him? Maybe they'd been traveling together for some time, which raises the question, what was his motive to kill her? And more importantly, right, who is he? And I don't think that this question will ever be answered. If the man was in his 50s in 1982, he's most likely dead by now, and since there was no sexual assault, it looks like there would be no DNA to compare against, to identify him, or to put in these databases to find him. I do hope that the police at the time scraped underneath Caroline's fingernails. It would just be something obvious, to see if there was signs of a struggle, to see if she'd gotten her attacker. And they may have gotten something, and the Coconino Sheriff's Office could very well have a DNA profile, but they haven't released it to the public. Once this new information came out connecting Valentine Sally to Carolyn Eaton, current Sheriff Jim Driscoll told True Crime Arizona, quote, "We have evidence and leads that we are currently following that we aren't able to share at this point. There's indications of things that we just aren't able to share," end quote. Jim Driscoll also told True Crime Arizona that there is a number of serial killers out there, which leads me to believe he's kind of the same mind that I am, that Carolyn was the victim of one of these killers who used the roadways to find their victims, commit their crimes, get rid of the bodies, and then get out of town. We know of so many killers just like this, but those are the ones who've been caught. Imagine how many are out there or were out there who never have been and never will be. What happened to Carolyn doesn't strike me as a one-time thing. If a man who's a truck driver or is used to driving these highways is picking up a girl on one of them and he ends up killing her, it's probably not his first rodeo, or if it is his first time, once he sees how easy it was to get away with it, he'll do it again and again, because the victims are usually people who don't have anyone looking for them. And the perpetrator can easily vanish into the night and be in another state when the sun rises the next day. Tracking down these kinds of killers is virtually impossible unless they do something stupid and get themselves caught. And even then, not all of these killers are like Henry Lee Lucas. They're not all going to be brought into custody for one murder and then admit to every other murder they've ever committed in their lifetime, right? They usually don't want to do that. There's another theory that this man Carolyn was with was the same man she'd been with the whole time, which means she would have left St. Louis with him. This is possible. Usually, young runaways won't leave their house unless they have a backup plan, or they have someplace to go, or they have someone that they know they can count on. So maybe Carolyn knew this man from her hometown, or maybe he was a truck driver who came through St. Louis a lot and they formed a relationship and she left with him. But if that's the case, why did he wait a year to kill her? So although I think it's a viable theory for those who have it, I don't think it's the most likely scenario. There is one person who will never forget Carolyn, and that's Patty Wilkins. Patty said when she met Carolyn, she was a pretty girl who smiled a lot. And she's always had this feeling that she could have done more to save Carolyn. It haunts her. Patty told True Crime Arizona, quote, "I wasn't there long enough, but I should have been there longer. I should have done more. What could I have done? What should I have done?" End quote. And this is a common feeling to have. Obviously, it's a normal emotion. And I think that if she wasn't having that emotion, there would be an issue of empathy there. Because technically, Patty was the last person to see Carolyn alive besides the person who killed her. So it's normal to have that feeling. But if you're watching this, Patty, or if anybody's watching this who's been in a similar situation where you're living with this guilt, this survivor's guilt, it's not your fault. You didn't take this young girl's life. You did what you thought was best. You did more than a lot of people would do in the same situation. A lot of people would see a young girl come in the middle of the night with an older man at a truck stop and maybe think this is suspicious, but not do anything about it because people don't want to get involved. They don't want to, they just don't want to get involved. So you did more than most people would do, and there's nothing to feel guilty about there. And like I said earlier, I know I voiced my personal issues with DNA companies. I personally don't like the idea of this company having my DNA, but I will say that if you're a person whose loved one is missing, maybe it is worth it to put your DNA out there and put it in some database. This is how Carolyn was eventually identified, because a family member spit into a tube to find out where their ancestors had come from. And because of this, a missing girl who was brutally murdered and discarded now has a name. And that means something, even though it doesn't solve the case, even though we don't know what happened to her or who did it to her. She has a name and she can be properly mourned. And when we talk about her case and we talk about her, we don't have to call her Valentine Sally. We can call her Carolyn Eaton. That is her name. So that was it for today's video. Let me know what you think about the case in the comment section. I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to search for similar cases in Arizona in the 80s, similar cases where young girls or even boys were found on the side of the road dead around this certain area on highways and things like that where truckers would normally be. I'm going to see how many of them there are to see if there's some sort of pattern with the timing, with how they were found. Because I just want to kind of compare. Like I said, I don't feel that somebody who does this to somebody else is just your normal, everyday, one-time killer. Not that that's normal or everyday. But when we see these cases or we talk about these cases, we've got somebody who kills somebody else, right? But it's usually for a reason. It's usually because of money or love or greed or jealousy, and those four things are all kind of interconnected, right? There's usually some reason, some motive, and they usually know the person. But in this case, with victims like Carolyn Eaton, I don't think it's a one-time thing. I have a hard time believing that somebody could just kidnap a stranger and then kill them and then throw them on the side of the road, and this is for a reason. There's no reason besides their own murderous drive, and that murderous drive doesn't go away after you kill one person or two people. So I think that this would be a pattern. And I need to look into Arizona and see where that highway goes, what states it goes through, and kind of just track along that path. Maybe even a path going east, because that's where Carolyn wanted to go. So maybe that's where her truck driver was headed. So I'm just going to do a little research and a little more deep investigation, and I'll let you know if I find anything. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Make sure to like this video if you liked it. Make sure to share it if you think it's worth sharing. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram. All my handles are in the description box. Also, there's a link to my podcast that I co-host with retired police detective Derek Levasseur. New episodes come out every Friday, and it's called Crime Weekly. The link is in the description box. It will lead you to the website where you can pick your platform that you usually listen to podcasts on. It also gives you the option to leave us a speak pipe message, so it's a voice message, and we listen to these messages, and we take requests, and sometimes we even play them in our podcasts. So thank you guys so much for being here. Next video will be part 4 of Bonnie and Clyde. Stay kind, stay beautiful, and please stay safe. I love you so much, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
Well, the levee don't break now, and the bottle's going straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say I Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly. So you got to let it go. I got blood